Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Emiliano Diaz-Leon. I am the Men's Engagement Specialist here at the Texas Association Against Sexual Assault, or TASA. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome back if you are coming back and joining us. If you have been part of our first virtual summit on male-identified survivors of sexual violence, thank you for joining us on the path towards healing. Thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. And of course, as folks join us, we want to welcome them. Please introduce yourself, say hi in the chat. We definitely will be using the chat function today. We are about 100 people in here right now, but it could potentially get a little bit bigger. And we want to encourage you to use the chat to share questions and comments throughout Jayvon's session, so that way he can engage with you. I want to thank our staff, our support staff, who you will find in the chat. They are here to help you at any time if you need any support, any information. Also want to encourage you to take care of yourself. I hope you had a lovely lunch and got some rest. You took a walk, did some yoga, whatever you needed to do during your lunch break. Thank you so much for joining us for the remainder of the virtual summit. I also want to encourage you to take care of yourself while we are still talking about male-identified survivors of sexual violence. We think it's really important that you take care of yourself. So at any time, if you need to speak to an advocate, our advocates are available, and we encourage you to reach out to them. And so they'll share those details in the chat. But at any point, if you need support or if you need to talk to somebody, please feel free to reach out to them. Again, thank you so much for joining us. We're really honored, and I'm thrilled to have my friend and colleague, Jayvon Howard. Jayvon is just a phenomenal human being. He's just an amazing man, and I couldn't be more thrilled to have him today for Men's Outreach, including male survivors and programs. Jayvon is the Engaging Men's Coordinator at our sister coalition, the Ohio Alliance to End Sexual Violence. I would definitely encourage you to follow them on social media. And I definitely encourage you to follow Jayvon. He does the thing, what is it called, Jayvon? Talk with Jay? What is it? What's the male survivor thing that you do on Instagram?
Q&A with Jay, engagement.
Q&A with Jay. I love it. Q&A with Jay. So like if you're ever looking for an opportunity to engage Jayvon, definitely tune in. All of those previous Instagram lives are available on their Instagram page, so go check those out. Jayvon is a great friend and colleague, and is an expert in the field as it relates to engaging men, and especially male survivors. So we actually share this work in common. So Jayvon, I'm going to give you the floor. It's yours, buddy.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Emiliano. First of all, thank you, and thank TASA and the staff and everyone on the team for inviting me and bringing me here today. I'm incredibly excited to see so many people who have men as survivors and male survivors on their hearts and minds, and are looking for more information to learn how we can better serve these populations and serve these communities. So I'm gonna go ahead and start my slideshow, and then go ahead and just get going with my presentation. Hold on, let me see. So I gotta share my screen first. And get my official intro going. Okay, can everyone see my screen pretty well? Okay, cool. So I'm doing a presentation today on doing men's outreach and programming, and including male survivors in programs. So reintroduction, my name is Jayvon Howard. My pronouns are he, him, his. I actually hold a lot of hats and do a lot of work. So I'm coming to join you all this afternoon actually as Jayvon Howard, representing my consulting firm as a social justice educator, family scientist, writer, and nonprofit consultant. The objectives that I really want to bring to you all today when we're talking about serving male survivors and we're talking about outreach and programming, I have a few different objectives, just three main ones that I want you all to have a takeaway for. So the presentation that I have is actually broken up into two pieces. So the first half of it is going to be more content heavy. We'll be talking more about why it's important to engage men in outreach. Why are we talking about male survivors in outreach? What does that look like? What kind of work has been done? What can the work look like in reality, and what those barriers have been around outreach and male survivorship? And then we're going to get into a bit more of the logistics and more practical ways of designing and organizing an outreach plan, how to do outreach strategies, how to do outreach, how to actually like walk through an outreach plan and design one for yourself, and then understanding some of those positive outcomes and what it looks like and can feel like for a survivor when we do this outreach and why it's so important. So these are the main three objectives I'm hoping to cover within this presentation. And with that being said, we're going to just dive right into it. So first of all, I've been doing outreach for, I don't know, about 6, 7 years. So my start really started way back in high school. But we're going to start where we are presently and kind of time travel backwards. I'm more of a tour guide in my college years. In high school, I had a lot of positions as different tour guides, doing lots of different things like that. So the way that I like to tell stories is sort of like tour guiding. So we're going to start where I am now and work our way backwards a little bit. So currently, my full-time position and where I do most of my engagement work is with the Ohio Alliance to End Sexual Violence. We are the accredited state coalition for serving rape crisis centers and the training and technical assistance organization for Ohio. As the Engaging Men coordinator, my role is focused on providing the technical assistance and the trainings for serving male survivors, as well as working with violence prevention around engaging men as well. So I talk a lot about manhood, masculinity, doing strategic planning, and then a lot of the programming that I do is related to outreach. So one of the first things that I noticed and I found when coming into this work, I came into the work officially about 5 years ago, but especially coming into the coalition level and doing this macro level work, really finding that a lot of the work is related to outreach, mainly because we're not having this conversation about engaging men whatsoever. It's great and it's wonderful that my position exists and that Emiliano's position has been around for some time. But the reality is like this work and having this conversation is still relatively new, that we're still asking questions about what do we do? How do we do this? What does the work look like? So a lot of the programming that I do is related to outreach, trying to create things like the Engaging Men Q&A that Emiliano mentioned, whereas really is about trying to get more people understanding the language. So it's like giving language into the world to be able to know what all this is about, what it looks like to engage men, et cetera, et cetera. Before I got to the coalition, I was the LGBTQ outreach advocate. So this role was mainly around doing outreach. And this is where I learned a lot of my strategic planning on how to really do successful ways of engaging communities and working in community engagement. So with this role, I mainly did a lot of things related to working with the LGBTQ population, but also because I was one of the only male advocates, I was also given a lot of the male survivors that would come through our programs for seeking services. So I had a support group that I actually started, one serving LGBTQIA survivors, which was across many different across the gender spectrum. So that included men and male survivors and trans men and trans women. A support group with incarcerated survivors, men, trans men, and trans women, unfortunately, who were detained with other men. And so we have support groups. I did outreach and working with those populations. I did support groups and worked with the homeless youth, which also overlapped with the LGBTQ population. More than 40% of folks who identify as homeless and as youth also identify as gay, lesbian, trans, bisexual, intersexual, queer. So a lot of this work with getting those special populations can be tricky. So what I did mostly was just like try to create pipelines. So the way that I approached doing outreach with having to work with these different populations who weren't coming to services, who had so many barriers related to like incarceration, related to homophobia, cultural and societal barriers that prevent people from coming forward or being able to access services. So the way that I approached it with doing these type of things and how I was successful with creating these programs and getting these support groups going was thinking about outreach in terms of pipelines. So the reality was that when we're talking about men and we're talking about male survivors, this population of men are seeking help. This population of men, they want help, they're looking for help, but they don't necessarily know how to ask for it. They don't necessarily feel like they're comfortable coming and seeking services from rape crisis centers, or even being involved with the anti-sexual violence movement. A lot of the time, the language that we use and the way that we organize our work around gender-based violence and ending gender-based violence is not inclusive of men. However, we know that men are within this population, and folks, if they're not coming to our services and they're still needing services and they're still needing help, they're still needing support through their trauma, they are going somewhere else. So you go start looking at places where men are already going for different kind of services, where people that they will be working with and talking to and opening up with and getting that information. So thinking about places, what I do some pipeline work. So I did some pipelines at places, fatherhood programs, job and family services, going to places where other support and human services and social service agencies that we were partnered with at the time, folks that we were connected to or who would be connected to a survivor, but and may not necessarily know how to work with that survivor. So creating those meetings, special events, setting up kind of like discussions and training. So going out of my way to try to reach out, reach out to local agencies, talking about this topic, doing presentations, doing trainings, canvassing, flyering, phone calls. And we were able to successfully get the word out, organize with these partners, and be able to get closer to these survivors, to be able to bring them closer to our services. Before I was in that role with as an LGBTQ outreach advocate, I also held a position as an engaging men like coordinator as well in college. It was more of like engaging, I guess it was engaging men coordinator. I didn't have a particular like title at the time. So it was more so volunteer and was social and club based. But we helped create this committee that was organizing around ending sexual violence and domestic violence on campus at my alma mater, Miami University of Ohio. So we started a few different programs working within the Miami Masculinities Committee. So what we found was most successful was interactive programming, things like poetry slams, where we gave opportunities for folks to come forward and really express themselves, spoken word, lecture series where we can bring in speakers to directly folks around allyship, to really speak directly with people. Are we good? I'm sorry. How long have I been unmuted? I mean, muted for?
Just for a second, we apologize for that. I just want to remind folks, if you're if you could ensure that you're muted, just not to interrupt our presenter, as well as to for any additional interruptions. So thank you.
No problem. So yeah, so then we did also have film screenings. So we had film screenings of things like misrepresentation, a call to men. We asked other colleges and universities that were doing similar work or were interested in this type of work. So we took advantage of opportunities like this where you look, we have over 100 people in this room right now, and we're here around the same idea, the same cause. We're all trying to get involved around serving male survivors, doing more outreach, doing closer outreach. It is as simple as just like putting your name into the chat and sharing your information and asking what is it that you guys are doing and how we can connect. So we did a lot of that type of work across Ohio colleges and different partnerships with rape crisis centers and local organizations that were working on ending the violence and ending domestic violence on campuses. And with that, we're able to put together film screenings and have discussions, support groups and men's groups that were non-clinical, but we also campaigned and advocated with the Student Counseling Center to maintain a men's group that was clinical as well, so folks could come and have those support group spaces. My slide isn't advancing. I have also did outreach in the community, so community action, organizing, and activism. So a lot of this outreach work is multiple tiered. It can be applied in many different spaces, but it can also look differently in these different spaces as well. So again, with the community action, organizing, and activism, it's a lot of collaboration. It's a lot of networking. It's organizing. It's canvassing. It's having meetings with people. It's spreading education and awareness, reading groups, utilizing social media, knowing how to safety plan. So some of these images are from when I was organizing in 2020, helping set up visuals and doing some of that pipeline work again of connecting people together around George Floyd's murder, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor. So the top picture is a visual that we were able to put together of over 300 people. We actually organized that overnight. We had thought of it and came up with the idea around 11 p.m. And then by 5 p.m. the next day, with just like sheer people power, that collaboration, that networking, really just reaching out and connecting with people. We were able to organize and get a big visual and a big group of people together. And we kept the momentum going for quite a bit as well. Being able to organize and talk and connect with people about ending violence and ending police violence. At the time, I was still working as an advocate as well. So I was very much advocating for the connections between police violence, ending sexual violence, ending intimate partner violence, and what it looks like for a transformative justice where we can work better with community orgs, with institutions, with communities, and really build on that to end violence and then better serve people who are seeking services and support. Too far. Okay. So with that being said, like, what is outreach? So I just talked a lot about the different types of things that I have been doing, about the work that I have done, and I named a lot of different ways in which that we were doing that work with the community organizing, with my day-to-day, with as an outreach advocate as well. So some of those things that I named out seems like, yeah, obviously that's outreach, but also what does this have to do with male survivors of violence? Asking the question, how is outreach for men and trans men who have experienced sexual victimization different than outreach for other populations? Right? That's why we're here. And asking the question, is there really a need to discuss men in particular? Like, shouldn't general outreach practices and strategies already be effective? Shouldn't general outreach strategies that we have already tried and been doing be effective and be able to pull us forward? Why are we having workshops about this? So first, we should identify what outreach is. So I have the definition here on the screen, and I'm going to read it out loud for folks who may not be visual and are able to see it. The definition for outreach that I have put together here is that strategies or efforts that identify and implement plans that fill in gaps in services and provide space for collaboration. Outreach focuses on extending or expanding partnerships and building new relationships. So that is what outreach is. Outreach is really just about expanding partnerships, extending what you're already doing, and building new relationships. And so what does that look like when we're talking about serving male identified survivors of violence? How do we build those relationships? How do we expand our services? But first, I want to get into and talk a little bit about some of those barriers that we're facing. When I ask those questions, why are we having this conversation in particular? Why don't typical outreach practices work? Why do we have to have a whole committee for this? Why do we have to have a whole role for this or a whole team for this? So when we talk about working with men and engaging men, the first thing we have to do, we have to acknowledge dominant privilege. We have to acknowledge dominant privilege, male privilege, and patriarchy. So we're going to talk a little bit about what I mean by all of those things. So when I said we have to acknowledge dominant privilege, so the first thing that we ran into, let's say for the Miami Masculinities Committee at my alma mater, when we're trying to do these campaigns for ending violence on campus and engaging men, we would do these campaigns, we would do our outreach, we would have tabling events, we'd send out email blasts, we'd have flyers going up, we'd go around to classrooms and talk about the work and what the issue. We partner with professors and even give out credit to people if they were to attend things. You know, we were doing a lot of that outreach and a lot of that work. But what we would find is that more often than not, folks who would attend would be female identified women, and then the men who would show up would be men who did not have as much privilege on campus. So there'd be men of color, men with lower socioeconomic backgrounds, men who are multi marginalized, so folks who have disabilities or handicaps of some kind. These were the folks who were showing up. I say that to say that the only population that we weren't seeing, or the populations that we weren't seeing showing up for this, well, for all of this, were men, and in particular, white men or men with wealth or men with certain particular privilege or status. So this is where we get into some of the issues and where we get into the main barrier that I wanted to recognize when we're talking about why we're having this conversation around outreach for male survivors and for men, is that men are socialized to maintain and perform certain masculine ideals, certain expressions, certain behaviors, certain types of attitudes and values. And many of these attitudes and these values and expressions are that men don't need help, that as men, we should be strong enough to be able to handle anything that we are already going through, or that we are not going through anything at all. That trauma, that pain, that violence are not things that men experience. This is what dominant privilege and this is what a system of patriarchy looks like, is that it gives this perspective and puts men into this box. And we socialize each other, and we socialize boys, and we socialize men, and we socialize girls, and we socialize women into believing that this is the way that men should be. And so when men are faced with these type of problems or challenges, even with the outreach that we do, even with the programs that we create, they don't always see themselves reflected. They don't always see that they are safe in those spaces. They're believed to be strong, to be tough and expressive providers, the protectors. You know, they can't be taken advantage of. That's what we tell men in our culture. They can't be taken advantage of. They can't be exploited. They can't be coerced. Failing to protect themselves or others are associated to be feminine qualities. And patriarchy and this organization of our culture and our society deems that anything that's related to or assigned to be feminine is of lesser value. And for men, you know, it is assigned that to maintain masculinity and to maintain your manhood is to not be feminine. So that means to not be weak. That means to not be dominated. That means to not be controlled. And unfortunately, we see this show up and manifest with men with trying to maintain their manhood, maintain their masculinity, maintain their dignity. And they may feel great shame about their experiences. They might feel great shame about and guilt about their experiences because it doesn't align with the way that they see themselves and the way that society expects them to be. And so that does a lot of damage to their emotional health, spiritual health, mental health, and sometimes we see in physical health as well, a deterioration and a drop with that, because that's the way it's organized and that's the way people will respond to not being able to be authentic and be able to be themselves or be able to seek support services when they want to. And so that's why I bring up the system, because it's what we live in. This is a culture. This is our social political system. It's connected to economic systems as well. But this is what men are dealing with on their day to day. And so when we talk about survivorship, you add in another level of trauma there. You're adding another level of needing support. Men need support and need nurturance and care just on day to day. But definitely when there's trauma and when there's this level of violence related to their lives, we have this major barrier of culture So outreach becomes important because we need to be able to reach over, beyond, and through and around a lot of this cultural work, in order to be able to get men to come forward to our services and to be able to connect with them better. It's just recognizing that first and foremost, that this is not easy for men to come forward. It is not something as simple as just like picking up the phone, no matter how many times we create a program. There's some consistency and intentionality that needs to happen behind it. I don't know why I keep skipping slides. So coming off of the previous slide, some of the myths that we have are from patriarchy, from that dominant privilege, from this culture. It kind of drives the cultural norms and the perspectives that we have about men not being able to be survivors. And because of this, men often fail to identify themselves as a victim or as a survivor of violence, whether that's because they don't see themselves as such, or they are nervous or afraid or fearful or ashamed of sharing that with others. And so they don't sometimes identify as a survivor, and that can affect their ability to view themselves as masculine. In addition, we have these myths that perpetuate throughout society. Again, these are some of the things that we are outreaching beyond and past, but this is what we need to recognize as the reason why we're having to do this outreach in the first place. If you understand why we're doing this in the first place, it makes it easier to be able to know what kind of projects and programs that might be appropriate for your community, for the men that are in your environment, the folks that you are serving in your space. The first myth, and there's a lot of myths, but I wanted to highlight these four. Men cannot be assaulted and are able to defend themselves. So as I'm going through this actually in the chat, I want you all to add, if you agree or disagree. So this is the first myth. Men cannot be assaulted and are able to defend themselves. And it's okay if you agree, we can talk about it. So I see a lot of disagrees. Okay, absolutely. So I'm seeing a lot of consensus coming in through the chat. So what about for myth number 2? Men are strong and therefore cannot be assaulted, and they also cannot be traumatized. We have some strongly disagrees coming in. I strongly disagree as well. Myth number 3. Men are supposed to be sexual and promiscuous and ready to go at all times. If there was an assault, it was welcome or he was lucky. Now, this is one that I hear very often, unfortunately, that men are always ready to go. This is a whole conversation about consent. Just what that means about consent and how that messes with men's socialization around what consent means and what it doesn't mean. If we are socializing our boys and men, that they should always be ready for sex, that they can never say no. And I hear stories all the time about men who talk about like they are literally nervous to tell their girlfriends, their wives, their partners, if they're not interested in sex that day, or if they are tired, because we have this myth that men are supposed to be ready to go at all times. And how that puts men into situations where they can be exploited or coerced. And we don't always think about it that way because, again, we think about men as being strong, being able to say like yes or no whenever, but that's not always the case. So myth number 4, men are sexually assaulted. Men who are sexually assaulted must be gay or bisexual. Agree or disagree? So disagrees, false. Absolutely. Well, yes, these are some of our pervasive myths. And so when I see a lot of folks in here disagreeing, which is great. But we know that the reality is that when we're talking about the larger culture, We do have people who agree. And like even some of us in this room may not have always disagreed. Maybe at some point we may have agreed with some of these myths and have had to grow and transform on them. But these are the pervasive things that we're looking at when we're talking about doing outreach with male survivors, that we have to be highlighting and making sure that what's the word I'm looking for? That this is what we're organizing around, like that we are trying to move past these cultural barriers and these cultural challenges. One of my mentors always says that people do not come with barriers. We place them there. Ourselves as people, we don't have barriers. We put barriers in between people. So with that, what does it look like to have so many of those myths? And so when I talk about this conversation about those myths, it's important to recognize why it's important, again, to do this outreach work. Men are more likely to be facing and interacting with an epidemic level of violence. Men have higher rates of committing acts of violence against themselves, each other, women and girls, higher rates of suicide, often by lethal means, higher rates of homicide. And I believe for all of those, it is up over 85%, I believe, of homicides are committed by men, or the survivor or the victim is a man. Binge drinking, substance use and abuse is high, risky and compulsive sexual behavior, lower relationship satisfaction, highest rates of physical illness, lower life expectancy than women. And so this is why we need to do this outreach. Because again, at the expense of serious health and public health consequences, like, because this is a public health issue. At these consequences, at this expense, doing this outreach and having these services are important. Men are aware that this is the reality of being a man, that we face these type of things, that these are the statistics, that this is, what our communities are going through. But they aren't seeking those services, they aren't seeking help. And our services and human services are designed mostly to provide support for women, children, and their families, and aren't often inclusive of men, which is why we go back again to this thing about patriarchy and dominant privilege and dominant culture, because we have such high rates of violence, and we have such high rates and such a high need of men who are very eager to get services, are very eager to get more support. And we're facing all these high rates of violence, but it doesn't exist for services. It's not prevalent enough. And then we could be out of this idea that boys will be boys. So we're leaving men without guidance, without that support, without that nurturance, and we are assuming that they're going to be fine. And then these boys are always doing what they're always going to do. And we're not recognizing trauma responses. We're not recognizing when someone's asking for help. Again, because we're just seeing, like, men are being men, boys are being boys. And so there's this cultural negligence that's occurring. At the same time, when we have this cultural negligence, it then feeds into the cycle of violence, then pours out and supports this patriarchal structure, because then the folks who are facing a lot of the violence then are folks who identify as feminine, women or girls, instead of things that are considered masculine. And then at the same time, our young boys and our men continue to struggle and continue to not have the support. And so again, this is a huge public health issue. This is some of the challenges that we are seeing, that we have to look at when we're trying to do more outreach. So I wanted to share this, what's the scenario case study? I guess this one's more of a scenario. I wanted to share this scenario with you all, so to articulate a little bit more about what some of these challenges and barriers for outreach looks like, and how it's rooted in societal and cultural work. And that when working with male survivors and like doing this work with outreach, it can sometimes feel a bit abstract. It can be difficult to measure. to define or to be precise. So part of understanding is one, taking in from that big space of dominant privilege and culture, having that operating more like in the background and connecting the theory into some practice. And so this is some way of our seeing what this practice could look like as far as like the experience of a male survivor. I understand that there was a panel and believe a conversation earlier as well. And so you can always apply a little bit what I'm saying to some of the conversations I might have had earlier. I wasn't able to attend, so I can't give out any examples or anything like that from there, but I can go ahead and read the scenario for you. So the scenario is Teddy received an invitation to male survivor support group. He has been to therapy once and didn't trust his counselor could help him. The counselor was a woman, and he worried that she would view him as not a real man. He has never attended a support group. The group meets once a week and is located near his work. He has never disclosed his trauma to anyone and spends most of his energy trying to distract from thinking about it. Sitting in a circle discussing his feelings feels unappealing. Even though this impacts his relationships, he worries that the men in his group will not understand, and he imagines that it would be less stressful to maintain his current habits. So just from this scenario, what are some of the barriers that you might be seeing that we might need to be addressing when we're doing our outreach? You can feel free to put some of that into the chat. I'm seeing representation, lack of normalization to talk about your feelings, absolutely. Maybe having a male counselor choice may have helped, potentially, absolutely. Avoidance and fear of vulnerability, stigma. So it's more coming in. I would want to comment on having like a male counselor. I think that was interesting because I think in some ways that can be beneficial and more helpful as a way of like connecting with men. Obviously, like men peer-based, thinking about peer-based support. Your peers are the ones who understand you more. Men having this general idea of being able to connect better with other men. But that idea and this fear of not being felt like a real man or seen like a real man can sometimes be something that shows up with other men as well. So that could possibly be something that could still be an issue that could show up with him. So we have fear of being known, absolutely. You know, being mindful when we're doing our outreach about location. So you mentioned that he has a support group that's near his work. You know, some survivors, aren't out, right? You know, we don't disclose. Not everyone discloses to other people. He says very in this one that he hasn't talked about it with anybody. He probably has definitely not indicated to anyone professionally or at work. So location and being mindful of the buildings that we choose to have some of our support groups. Like, is it in on a busy district or plaza? Do we have certain signage that indicates like what the group is in a way that might give away anonymity? So these are some of the things that to be mindful about. So I see privacy issues popped up. There's a longer comment here I would like to read, and then we're going to move on to the next slide, if that's okay, just for timing. So how would you recommend, oh, this was a question. That's fine, I'm already reading it. How would you recommend being there for someone who's experiencing trauma responses from a known issue, but they don't want to talk through it? Obviously, just being there and asking how best to be there for that person, but they're clearly struggling and don't want to talk. Where do you go from there without making them uncomfortable enough to pull away or isolate? Both for men and boys and all genders, from my experience, this tends to be more common with men. Yes, so you touched on a point. Thank you, Caitlin, for that. You definitely touched on a really good point about trying to prevent them from pulling away and withdrawing and isolating. But that's something that is common among a lot of survivors. Withdrawal and discomfort is a trauma response. And this trauma responses are difficult to, I don't want to say get over, I want to say heal from, in just one sitting. A lot of times we're like in this scenario, if this is the first times or the few times talking with someone about anything that's that devastating, that personal and private, it is a little bit of patience. A lot of this work, sometimes we have to think in terms of decades, because we have such a heavy cultural burden that are sitting on men's shoulders. That's not going to be overcome in just a couple of weeks and a couple of months. Sometimes it takes years for folks to undo, to be able to feel comfortable. So I would say just like, lean into your expertise, know that you are, the advocate that you are, that you're able to provide that support, and just keep providing it the best as you can, and just respecting that survivor's needs and boundaries. And that's like the best way to move forward with that. So, quote from bell hooks. I love bell hooks. I get a lot of my training and expertise just from like reading a lot of her work. I would say if you have not engaged with bell hooks or any of her writings or her teachings, I definitely encourage you to do so. Not just for working with men and understanding men and survivorship, but also just like a better way of living and loving, and connecting with people. But bell hooks is definitely someone who has put in a lot of energy and effort and expertise into understanding patriarchy, understanding male socialization, and as well as male victimization. And so what we are seeing even in the scenario that we just discussed a little bit, is well represented here in this quote by her, that the first act of violence that patriarchy demands of males is not actually violence towards women. Instead, patriarchy demands that all males engage in acts of psychic mutilation, that they kill off emotional parts of themselves. So this is to say that, despite the traumas that men may be facing or dealing with, that we are taught first and foremost and socialized first and foremost that, we're supposed to just hold on to that, that we're not supposed to be feeling anything that we are feeling, especially when it's something that makes us feel so ashamed, embarrassed sometimes, guilty, afraid, distrustful, that this is a major barrier. And this is where these type of things animate from. And so with that, with a little bit of the content and the background of where we're coming from, so always leaning in with love when we're doing this work, when we're doing outreach. What does it look like to actually design and implement outreach with all of that in mind? With all the barriers, with understanding male survivors, with understanding this macro level of cultural systems, understanding the microcosms of interconnections and interpersonal relationships and community, designing and implementing outreach. So this is more of the practical stuff. So feel free to get some pens and pencils out, take some notes. This is more of the practical of like, what do you do to actually get started and get going? And then we're gonna have a little part where maybe we can fill some things in together. I wanted to break us out into breakout sessions, but there are too many of us for that today. So hopefully you're able to take down some notes to be able to work through some of these things with your own team on your own time, or maybe connect with somebody new here while we're together, and then we all work together on some new way of doing men's programming. I would love to see that. You can connect with me also. So the first thing to do for designing and implementing outreach, goals and objectives. That seems pretty obvious. So know exactly what it is that you are trying to do. Like, what is your objective? Are you wanting to do education? Are you trying to do awareness? Are you trying to move, is your goal to have an increase in services? Are you trying to get an increase in folks attending your support group? Are you trying to create a support group? What is that outreach goal exactly? What is your objective? What are you trying to get from all this work that you're putting together around serving male survivors? Because we say things like, we want to engage men, we want to serve male survivors, we want to support survivors, but what does that look like? What is your specific goal? What is it that is missing. So that goes into identifying gaps in services. So what is it that's missing with your services? Where are the areas of improvement? Do you have survivors who maybe are coming to support group, but they're not utilizing the hotline? You know, you're not having survivors calling. Maybe you're only having survivors who are calling, but they're not coming physically to any of the things that they, you know, that you are putting together. What are those gaps in services? Who's being served, who's not being served, and how does that connect to your objective? So measurements. One moment, actually. I think I want to add 2 gaps in services. So what that could look like for identifying gaps in services. So doing like surveys, very popular doing surveys. Evaluations are important. Collecting data wherever you can, and sometimes being creative with how you collect data. For those who work, within the field, that data can sometimes be a pain in the butt to collect. A lot of times we are collecting it around grants and around funding sources, but it's important to also collect data for improvement for our programming, to understand really what are survivors going through on their day to day. What is it that they're looking for and they're needing? Because we could be doing a lot of programming that we feel is really good for our community. Maybe like 3 years ago, somebody said, hey, we really, really need this for our community. And it took us 3 years to start really implementing it. But at that point, maybe something else is more relevant. So always doing those surveys, evaluations. I would say asset-based evaluations, so community asset-based. If you're not familiar with that term, that means it's like focusing on the assets, the things that are going really well in your community already, and then seeing how you can expand on those things and building off of that. So then measurements, evaluations, and metrics. So being precise and knowing what those metrics are. So again, so with your objectives, if your objective is that you want to grow your support group and your way of connecting with men with those type of peer-based educational social circles. The measurements of what that could look like. Does it look like a 200% increase from what your current attendance is? Does it look like having a 300% increase? Does it look like just simply having more people, call about the support group? Does it look like having a certain amount of facilitators who are interested? Does it look like having a certain amount of registrations? Like, be specific about what your measurements look like and what success could look like for this. Without knowing that those evaluations and those metrics, a lot of times you'll just be doing outreach blind. You won't know what's working, what's not working, whether or not it's something you can continue doing. Again, like I was saying before, like doing this work as outreach can sometimes be a bit nebulous. And so it's really important to have those metrics to measure what you're doing. Otherwise, you might just be doing something over and over again and it's having no impact whatsoever. And that is not helping a community, it's not helping survivors. It's also a waste of your time, your expertise, where you could be doing something, better with your time than what you have been. Recognizing timelines and deadlines, being aware of those, and then prioritizing. I would say that's important because sometimes, one project might take longer to do than another. So be mindful of those timelines and those deadlines and prioritize your capacity. Research. So this is definitely connected to capacity a bit as well, but do your research, know the needs of your community, know who's in your community. Doing those evaluations, those focus groups, assessments are important. It's getting the outreach plan together and knowing exactly what those programs and events, special spaces could look like and could be. When I say capacity matters, that it takes a village, just understanding that, being creative with some of your strategies, that people work 9 to 5, that people work third shift, that there are barriers with things of like technology. People live in rural communities. Knowing, your community, are you engaging and doing outreach locally? Are you doing it statewide? Are you doing it nationally? And organizing with partners that have the same cause, and having a team. Outreach sometimes is considered something that shouldn't be built into strategic planning or built into our programs. And so sometimes you might see like an outreach coordinator or an outreach facilitator or someone who is working independently. And even though like an outreach person by themselves can probably get a good amount done, everything works better with a team. Being creative and imaginative with outreach is important because what you're literally doing is reaching out. Is about getting past those barriers. It is bridging them. It is helping fill in those gaps that you have identified. It's trying to be as efficient, as effective as possible around that because it's easy as just saying we are here. We wouldn't be having a conversation about outreach. So it's really just like putting in that manpower, putting in the effort. It takes a village. Everyone has to contribute however that may or may not look like. So yes, I would definitely say like know who's in your community, know the needs of your community, research, and that capacity matters. It does take a village. We are all here together. We're all sitting right next to each other. I know it doesn't always feel like it, but we are on the same planet, on the same little sphere together, doing all this work. We can work together and connect and collaborate to overcome a lot of these barriers and challenges. Outreach is really just about, like I said, it's about reaching out. It's about building trust. It's about building partnerships. Communication is important. Consistency is important. Reliability is important. Trying not to, bite off more than you can chew. There's a lot of work that we can do. There's a lot of imagination that goes into things, but remembering that doing the precise planning, the timelining, ensures that you're able to get the goals together that you're hoping to. And also recognizing that outreach is not the same as marketing. Marketing can be a part of your outreach strategies and a part of implementation around outreach, but outreach is not about marketing. Remember, outreach is expanding services. Like it's about extending partnerships and building connections. It's about connecting to people and connecting those people to each other, connecting people to services and services to people. It's not the same as marketing, where marketing is more so you're wanting something from somebody. That's important to distinguish when you're working with survivors or doing community engagement like this, is that you don't want anything from someone. You're not trying to take anything away from anybody. What you're doing is that you're offering, and you're talking about what you're offering and you're sharing what it is that you're offering, but it is not required or necessary for anyone to actually take it, what you are offering. And that's something as like an advocate or an outreach coordinator, or just like being like someone who works, might have to get comfortable with. That sometimes people are not going to respond to your outreach or to your programs and the things that you're doing. And that might mean that you might need to do better marketing. It doesn't mean transform your outreach where it is only marketing, because people aren't looking to be sold to when they're looking for support. Our survivors aren't trying to be sold to. They know what you're about. They just want to know if you're about taking care of them. They want to know if you're about listening to them and understanding them. And it's about letting your work speak for itself. And the outreach is really about showing what that work is and highlighting those victories. That communication is important. Connect with partners, share with them about the things that you're doing, connect with other social services in your community and share with them about what you're doing. A lot of times we're all doing very similar work. Sometimes we're working with the same person or the same people. Of course, confidentiality, we wouldn't necessarily know. But if our services were overlapping, we would be better to be able to pipeline each other and pass someone to someone else, or even be able to call somebody and have the information on hand to be able to work with someone in real time. So there's considerations of culture, special populations, and multiple marginalized identities. It's very important to consider that not everyone is created equal. Equality and equity are different things. And so it's about acknowledging that and being intentional and mindful about that. This is also where capacity sometimes becomes really important, because again, like people don't come with barriers, but there are barriers in place by design that can make outreach a little bit difficult. It can also make highlight the reason why outreach is so important, about bridging the gaps between the barriers and the services that people might be facing. So check in to see, are you able to even accept these populations after you're doing outreach or are doing outreach? Are you accessible? Do you have interpreters? Do you have closed captioning? Is your building accessible to people to be able to even get inside and get out? Being mindful of folks who are like incarcerated. So I mentioned and talked about that I did worked with folks who were incarcerated a few years ago. So just being incarcerated and being detained, I don't know if you ever visited anyone in jail or in prison, or you've been in jail or prison yourself, but it is incredibly oppressive and it's very difficult to get information in and out to people, especially support services, especially to survivors or multiple marginalized people who need services who are survivors while incarcerated. And so one of the things that I was able to do and for my outreach to get people into a support group and be able to meet with me, I just created a 2 to 4 question survey that just identify, like, have you had this particular life experience? Have you had anyone, touch your body without consent, and say very quickly, like 2 or 3 words of what consent, what consent is. Mainly because I wasn't allowed to put up a flyer in there. They weren't allowed to have colors of anything. I couldn't pass anything out. You can't make phone calls to people. You can't go canvass in the prison. So being a bit more creative and coming up with just like 2 to 3 questions that you can just really quickly screen for people, and then they will know to be able to come have access to contact you. And it also provides that space where they don't have to self-identify, and they also have that anonymity of disclosure. So being mindful of the specific special barriers. So again, like doing your research, know your community, know what is going on with folks to be able to create outreach that's equitable and that's relevant and doesn't like this one size fits all. Creating a safe space, internal, external. So I kind of just already talked about that a little bit. So do you know what to do with people once they arrive? This might be a little bit outside of outreach. This might be a little bit more of like that implementation of outreach, or maybe policy work, or just procedures, SOPs, standard operating procedures that you may have. But knowing what you're going to do with survivors when they arrive. So part of my work that I do with the coalition is preparing advocates and preventionists for working with men. We say we were doing this outreach. We really want men. We're really eager for men to come forward. But are we ready for the reality of working with male survivors and what it looks like to work through male victimization and work through male trauma and work through these type of things with this different populations that maybe we haven't worked with before. So knowing that like language matters, revisiting that scenario of that survivor support group. So like the support group was named Male Survivor Sexual Assault Support Group. So maybe being mindful of language. Sometimes language that's that direct can be something that's off-putting for people. Being mindful of language of the programs, of your program, of the project that you're putting together, being very explicit that you are trying to serve male survivors, being very explicit about that, and then having that safe space where you're able to facilitate, you're able to communicate, you're able to connect with people and feel comfortable and safe. So using language maybe like gathering or club, support group, not support group, community, dialogue, conversation. Sometimes using terms like support group can feel too clinical for people. So things like gathering, club might feel better. Those type of things can make the space feel better and safer. Having representation, not only just like in your flyers or on your materials, but also in your staffing, in your leadership. These are parts of the things that you have with that is part of outreach. It needs to be more blended into a lot of different programs and into a lot of the work. And this is why I said capacity matters, because if we want to do real effective outreach, it takes a village. It takes a village because we're here and people are just looking to get connected to and to be connected with. Consistency is key. So be consistent. We know that sometimes we put on campaigns and that we have times where it's like we're really excited about a particular working with a particular population or having campaigns. So like maybe 1 week or 1 month, we all have this virtual summit or we have this conversation about servant male survivors, but then we don't talk about it again for another year or another 2 years, and it never comes up from our agencies. So we're talking about from a perspective of like survivors, right? Um, Survivors who already aren't feeling very trustful or aren't coming forward. This outreach is about building trust. It's about building capacity. People should know what to expect from you. And if we want people to expect consistency, we want people to be able to expect that they can rely on us for the work that we do and how we connect with them. And it's really built into a lot of that primary prevention work that ultimately at the end of the day can, uplift men and empower survivors. So being consistent and being present is really central to a lot of this community engagement work. So designing your own outreach plan and strategy. So this is the part where I wanted to do sort of like an activity with us. So let's see if we can, if anyone has like pen and paper, I would say try to do something. What are my instructions here? 5 columns if you have pen and paper, and naming them project activities, objectives, expected outcomes, timelines, deadlines, and who works on this. So this is what it looks like to do and design an outreach strategy. So there's lots of different ways to design one, lots of different ways to put one together. This is sort of the template that I tend to use when I'm putting together my first draft for an outreach strategy. So the first column would be project activities. This is where you would name the activities that you would be working on. Like, what is the project? Is this a resource? Is this a social event? Are we doing a summit? Is it a support group? Like, what is this project? And then what are those objectives, goals, and deliverables? Why are you doing this? What needs to be done? What are those major tasks that need to be taken care of? And then expected outcomes. What do you expect to see as a result? What measures are you using? And what does success look like? I think that's really important when you're talking about expected outcomes. Again, like this word can be nebulous, so trying to be more precise and specific. What does success look like? What is that outcome that we're hoping for? Timelines, deadlines, important dates. How long will this take? How long do you plan on working for this? Is this something that needs to be worked on for a month, 3 months? Can it be done in a couple quarters? Or is this something that needs to be like a strategic plan where we're working on it for 2, 3 years? What are those timelines? What are those dates that we need to be meeting in between? What are deadlines that are first and final and important? And then marking important dates. So like knowing when you can meet and when you can't meet, recognizing certain spaces like that. And then who works on this, and just listing out like the roles and responsibilities that are needed and necessary in order to complete the project activity. So what are all the roles needed? Do you need, so I'm going to use TASA as an example. Do you need chat support? Do you need a moderator? Are we having speakers or facilitators? Who are these people going to be who we're going to call in contact for that? Who's committing to what responsibilities, and what are those responsibilities going to be? Who's taking leadership? So putting that out there and working out those details for who works on this and those type of strategies is really helpful and useful. So I had wanted to try to do some sort of group activity with that. So I think I might just pause for like 3 minutes or so to give folks an opportunity to maybe think about for themselves for some sort of, what kind of outreach strategies have you been working on or are working on? What type of things are you doing related to working with men? And maybe spend like 2 or 3 minutes just like working out some of those things on your own. And then what do you think? What do you think, Emiliano? Do you think 2 or 3 minutes would be long enough? Maybe 5 minutes? And then we can reconvene and maybe talk a little bit about it.
Yeah, thank you, Jayvon. I really appreciate this chart, and I have something, I use something similar, called planning for action around engaging men, right? Because that's definitely a part of our work. And so it really aligns really nicely with this chart. Yeah, I think it would be helpful for folks to, as they're completing this chart, if you have any questions or any thoughts about like the why, right? Um, this is definitely a great opportunity for you to ask Jayvon, or the how. I saw that um, somebody, talked about, one of your references earlier about, when you're talking about outreach and you're engaging in surveys and with survivors, like it's a very specific question around virtual and in person, but I think it's a great question to incorporate, like if you're conducting those surveys or you're planning sort of your outreach, to really be specific about what kind of, what you're looking for. Because if you can create multiple opportunities for you to engage men, to engage male identified survivors, I think that's even better.
Let me see if I can. Okay, I got the chat. Have any of your surveys shown a preference to virtual support groups over in person? I don't think I've seen a particular preference. I think that's hard to say because we've been in a pandemic, so a lot of the work has been mostly virtual right now.
Yeah.
So it's hard to say for sure, like if it's people prefer virtual or in person, whether because it's like the circumstances of the world right now. But I haven't seen one over the other. Right now, to be honest, a lot of folks, we're struggling a little bit with having support groups with men just because of capacity. Um, Folks don't always have enough staff to be able to show up to have a support group to work with men or to manage all the different support groups that they have, or vice versa. On the other end, I have heard that there's not enough men who are coming to programs to like fill out surveys or evaluations to even get enough information on whether or not what is preferred or needed.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, like this, if you build it, they will come kind of mentality, right? It's like approaching of creating with the assumption that folks will take advantage. It takes a while to build services, to your point earlier. And I think, 1 in 6 offers a virtual support group for male survivors of childhood sexual abuse. So definitely check out that. Like I said, Men Healing is offering a virtual support group currently for their alumni of their weekends of recovery. They are looking to open it to any male survivor of sexual violence. So that's really exciting. And so if you're not following Men Healing, 1 in 6, malesurvivor.org, they offer, all kinds of different ways for men to get information, get resources, get support. Again, there's no one way, but it is really looking at like what works best, whether it's a video chat, Zoom, like all of these, there's multiple platforms that you can use to provide support. But I think the question for the workshop is, how do we promote those things? How do we get men to show up? And I think, being really creative about the content that you use. Of course, here at TASA, we have a whole communications department, a graphic designer. So the graphics for this event are designed in-house. But most folks don't have that, right? They don't have a department. They don't have a graphic designer. So, be creative, utilize as you're creating outreach materials, be really creative around how you promote those things. Canva is your friend, it's anybody can be a graphic designer. So, use those different tools that are available either at low cost or free, to create content that is engaging, that gets people attention, and build that into your plan. And I think, I think that's really important to think about, Jayvon. It's like, as I was looking at this, I was like, this is
Yeah,
super helpful. Yeah, this is really,
I
really
tell
helpful.
I tell folks all the time that, especially when doing like social media and things, that we are induated with over, like, I think the stat that I read was between 1,500 and 2,000 pieces of information from just social media a day.
Wow.
Um, and so it's like, that's a lot of information that's coming at you in a day, and like trying to sort through all of that. So being mindful, like when you're doing that outreach, that, like, people might see your work, but they're also seeing like 1,900 other things that day too, potentially. So what does it look like to really stand out, like to be intentional and be specific? Because you don't want folks just like looking at it and not getting any information or knowing what's going on. If they are being overwhelmed like that, you want them to stop and pause long enough on yours to remember, put it into a calendar, or you just get curious. So like definitely like utilize all your tools and resources as much as you can.
Yeah, good point, Jayvon.
And so I do have a couple more slides. I think that was a long enough time for folks to sort of fill out anything. I don't know if folks wanted to share a little bit about what some of the projects that they have come up with in the chat, um, and maybe some feedback about what you feel about if this was a helpful strategy or not. And you think it's something that you'll use going forward.
Yeah, in addition, for folks who, I mentioned it, it's shareable, and I encourage folks to use it. It's specific to engaging men around prevention of sexual violence. And so it could be around anything that action plan. But I mean, for the purposes of this discussion, you could use it to plan your outreach efforts around engaging male identified survivors of sexual violence, right? Or,
Correct.
engaging men around a broader set of issues. But I think it's a useful tool. It really aligns very nicely with your chart here.
Thank you.
Mhm.
I lost the chat.
Anybody interested in sharing? Like, we have about 130 people in the room. So if you open up your audio, it shouldn't be disruptive as long as multiple people don't open up your audio. So if you want to share your plan, and get a little bit of feedback from Jayvon, here's your opportunity.
We can also, excuse me, we could also connect separately in case like folks don't want to share their plan in front of everyone.
No
Uh,
judgment.
I think after you said like 100 people, I was like, ooh, I might be nervous.
Yeah, it's a lot of folks. And
But I did want to
I
have
completely
time for
get it.
folks to pause and be able to sort of like work through and ask any questions in this moment. Well, with that being said, we're gonna move on just a little bit. So tips and tricks I wanted to share about doing outreach. One, language matters. I already kind of touched on this, but be very mindful and intentional of language. Uh, Words are like the main way that we use to communicate and connect with each other. So use them. There are so many of them for us to use, but it does matter. Recognize in-group, out-group words, things like that. I know that social media is a way that we try to do outreach a lot, and like TikTok and Instagram are really popular ways that we are trying to do programs. But recognize that language does matter. Not everything, the ways that communities interact and exchange with each other is necessarily appropriate for us to do as advocates or professionals. And just be mindful of that, or like thinking about socially and culturally, like groups that we belong to, that some things are within a group and not belonging to any other group. And that even though that's a great way to connect with people, we don't necessarily need to engage with that with our outreach, as a service and an organization. So being mindful of that. Tips and tricks for saying you. So I learned this one when I was in a fundraising and development program. saying you when you're doing outreach is very important. So when you're creating some sort of any kind of flyer, any kind of correspondence that's going out externally, saying the word you as many times as you possibly can actually connects and engages people much more. So that's a fun little trick and tip to think about when you're doing outreach. Be authentic and genuine. Again, it's not marketing. You're not selling to people. We're not trying to get something from someone. We just want to connect. You want to reach out. You want to build and expand what you're already doing and help bring more people in. So be authentic and genuine about that. Share and celebrate your victories. So share and celebrate them. Talk about them a lot. Talk about them with the community. Tell partners what you're doing, other folks in the community who might be doing similar work. Talk about those victories, and then share that information. It takes a village. We can all learn from one another, and it's also important to uplift and empower each other whenever we are doing such important work. Have patience. All of this is work that's decades in the making. It takes time. We're not trying to force anybody to do anything. We want people to walk the path to heal. And that takes everyone's on their own journey. They're all on their own path for that and their own timelines. So to have patience with people. We can't want something for someone more than they're wanting it for themselves. We can't force people to be ready for things that they just aren't ready for. Again, our job is just to reach out. And that's what we're doing when we're doing outreach. So tips and tricks for that. And then some men's outreach programs I wanted to share and shout out for really quickly, that I feel like do really good men's engagement work. They're not necessarily engaging men as survivors. Again, that's why we do the work that we do. Like a lot of the things that are happening, we're not talking about survivorship and talking about men as victims of violence. However, we are talking about like outreach and working with men and getting men involved in programs and getting those numbers up. Here's some programs that do a really excellent job of being able to connect with men. So we have a call to men. They're the national org that works a generation of men that work with athletes, young college-aged men and youth around respectful manhood, anti-violence, and they have a really nice live respect curriculum that has been pretty successful for engaging men. I had to shout out the Ohio Men's Action Network. I used to be co-chair for OMAN. So right now they're doing the Courageous Conversations, where they're bringing men together to have critical conversations about all sorts of topics related to masculinity and healthy masculinity, healthy manhood, how to heal, how to grow, and how to own yourself. Men Can Stop Brave speaks for itself. Men Can Stop Brave. They do wonderful engagement, especially around youth and college. NAMEN, the North American Men Engaged Network, they do a lot of programming internationally as well, but they do a lot of policy work, training, education. So they're definitely a great outreach program to check out. And then the Alliance for Men and Boys of Color. This was recommended as a great outreach program by, again, a couple of trusted mentors. I haven't actually worked with them myself, but I have looked at the work that they have done, and it's really great. So I wanted to highlight and uplift them in this space here today. And then you have questions. So that would be the conclusion of my presentation officially. If you have any questions, I have time for those. And this is how you can contact me. The best way to contact me is probably through email. You can keep up with what I'm doing through my Instagram, just call him Jay. And then my website as well. My website is under construction a little bit. It will be ready soon. Whatever soon means to you, it will be ready soon. And so that is the conclusion of my presentation. Thank you all for having me. So yeah, if there's any questions.
Jayvon. Yeah, folks. Well, while we still have Jayvon, we have a few more minutes here before we wrap up the virtual summit. Just as a reminder, unfortunately, our last speaker is out sick, and so he won't. Jim from Men Healing won't be able to join us today, and so this will be the wrap up of today's virtual summit, but so I want to make sure that you have an opportunity to ask questions. I did share a link to a resource specifically for around male survivors of sexual violence. You know, I will have to, I will definitely ditto that list of organizations. You know, I would add the Texas Men Speak, you know, that Jayvon has been a part of over the last year. We're celebrating two years of the Texas Men Speak next month. And it's a fantastic initiative. If you are working with any male identified person here in Texas or even around the country, we encourage them to join us for our virtual gatherings. And we're also currently conducting a monthly book club exploring Men Enough, Justin Baldoni's book. And so we encourage you to share that with the men in your life and encourage them to join us for that initiative. So there's some really great resources in the Men Resources link, so feel free to share and forward that to folks in your network. Do folks have any questions or comments? I don't know if our moderators have noticed any questions, or maybe we,
Yeah,
you know.
there
Yeah,
was
please.
one early on. Jayvon, when you were talking about myths, there was a question, particularly about the last myth, just your thoughts of would those be mostly educated versus uneducated, or males versus females that agreed with the last myth, was the question.
Okay, so to clarify, for around the last myth, do I see more people agreeing or disagreeing based on their gender?
Yeah, for those that agree, would they be mostly educated or uneducated, and then based on gender?
Oh, that's a good question. I am not sure. Here, let me look at what the myth was again really quick. Which one was that? Men who are sexually assaulted must be gay or bisexual. Well, I don't know. I feel like those type of things are more so a belief. So I would say, generally speaking, folks who have more education about gender justice and around or sexual orientation and sexuality will more likely disagree with that statement that men who are sexually assaulted must be gay or bisexual. But that's not always necessarily the case, because again, we're talking about this system of like patriarchy. It's this idea and this culture that men have to be a certain way, that they're expected to be a certain way and to perform a certain way. And a lot of the time is that performance is heterosexual. And that there's this idea, of course, like one, the myth, we have a rape culture where the myth is that, you know, rape is not real in general, that rape, especially against women or men, is something that doesn't actually happen, that it is something that happens like in the dark, that is a stranger, that is random, that if it does happen, it's somebody else's fault. It's never, it's like, it's the survivor's fault. Like we live in this culture where we already kind of do this victim blaming. And so this kind of comes out of that same thread of victim blaming. And it's sort of, for men, it's connected to patriarchy, it's connected to masculinity. Whereas for women, it's connected to like more like femininity and being a woman and what that socialization looks like when we victim blame. So this victim blaming for men just looks like you're not supposed to be gay or bisexual to be a real man. And so if you engage in any kind of act that looks or feels that way, whether it's consensual or not, you must be gay or bisexual. And then there's also the prevailing myth that's connected to this as well, is that sometimes there is a physical response with your body if you are experiencing trauma. So it's men who are experiencing sexual trauma sometimes have erections, sometimes they even ejaculate when they're being assaulted. And that can be really confusing for men to feel like maybe, well, did I like it? Am I actually gay? This was something I was, you know, really wanted. And they don't understand necessarily that this is like a trauma response. And it's also just like a natural physical bodily response to certain stimulus. And so that's where that kind of comes from. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you for that. We do have another question for you in the chat. Chris asks, do you have any suggestions as to how male leaders in these endeavors can approach the subject while still respecting and acknowledging the female identifying folks who trailblaze the way for us, as well as avoiding any sort of, well, men get assaulted too, / all lives matter, feel that so frequently permeates the topic of male survivors? I'm thinking about the sort of performative use of the theoretical question to marginalize the experience of female identifying folks and how to avoid that sort of tint to the conversation or the work.
Yeah, thank you for that question.
Yes, thank you. I love this question. This is actually something that comes up with my work a lot, where it feels like it needs to be a fine line, and it can feel like how do we have this conversation? Now, I would say simply it's about accountability. It's about recognizing and really loving and bringing in that space of accountability and transformation, that we have room and space to grow and to change, and that, it's really ultimately about ending violence. It's about, trying to create safer communities for all of us, safer lives for all of us, because we all deserve to live free from violence. But at the same time, this point of this masculinity, this man who's showing up with this privilege, this power, maybe even is someone who has committed violence or could commit violence, but is a survivor. And that's the reality of being human a little bit, that we all carry trauma and that we all enact certain levels and degrees of harm and violence against each other always, and that we have always done that. And that the goal is to not do that anymore. And the goal is to recognize I have done harm, and that does not excuse the harm that has done to me and does not give me permission to do harm to others, but I still can be taken care of. That we all still deserve to be taken care of, to be loved and work through whatever we need to work through. And at the same time, you can still be held accountable for things that you have done. So it's about really centering that in the conversation. That yes, I see you and I hear you, but we are all here together. And then that's the point where we're all a community. And sometimes it feels like we're not all together in the community, but we're all in here together with ripple effects. I'm in Ohio. I'm all the way over here in Ohio, and I'm virtually talking to people from all over the country about sexual violence. Someone enacted a disruption in the world of violence and brought us all together. So we're all here together. So we can hold each other accountable and hold space for each other for all sorts of things at the same time.
I appreciate you saying that, Jayvon. I mean, that's why I appreciate this question. We're exploring that particular issue at this month's Texas Men Speak, right? This whole concept of accountability of male allies, right? So how do we hold ourselves accountable? And then how do we collectively hold each other accountable? And how do we allow ourselves to be held accountable by the movement, right? And I think that these are, I say this a lot, it's a critical ongoing conversation that we're having with each other, and then we have to have with women identified folks, right? And I think we have to acknowledge that this space wouldn't be possible if it wasn't without the girls and women who have struggled and who have worked so diligently over the last 5 decades or more to create TASA, in order for TASA to be able to host this space, right? On this particular topic.
So much of the history of that you bring up is that men weren't supposed to be excluded in the first place in a lot of that history. So yeah, a lot of the history was built where men were supposed to be included, and again, patriarchy, men who had this allegiance to patriarchy, women who had this allegiance to patriarchy, then interrupted and then convinced men that the movement wasn't for them, that it was feminist, and that made it feminine, and so then it wasn't for them. And so we're kind of just picking up the pieces now with the work that we do.
Yeah, and I'll say for myself, I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for women leaders, women mentors, women like Rose, our CEO here at TASA, who welcomed all of us this morning. So, I mean, so I think we, you know, we have a lot of examples of that. But, you know, I think there's an opportunity for male identified folks who are engaged in this work to begin to also open that door for other male identified folks, and to invite them into this space, and to be accountable, not just to women, but to other men, right? Like, I think it's just part of the ongoing conversation, even around male survivors, is like, we want to see an increase. If you are a man who is watching this and you've never considered volunteering with your local rape crisis center, I want to invite you and encourage you to join us. It's so important to consider volunteering, or you know, becoming an advocate, or just donating a little bit of your time to support survivors of sexual violence in your community, to become a member of TASA, to join all of our efforts, to join the Texas Men Speak, all the things that we're doing, to join the Ohio network. So wherever you are in this country and territories, I want to encourage you to get involved and to join these efforts, because that's so important to model for other boys and men to do this work. You know, because, you know, me and Jayvon are just two men, but we're part of a larger growing network of masculine identified folks around the country and the world that are engaged in the work around healthy masculinity and ending gender-based violence for all people. So yeah, thank you so much for leaving us on that solid note. Thank you so much. Please give Jayvon a round of applause. Use your little reactions emoji.
Thank you.